The first thing Sergeant Decker did when he saw her rifle case was laugh. Not a chuckle, not a smirk behind a raised coffee cup. A full open-mouthed laugh that bounced off the concrete walls of the armory at CFB Petawawa and drew the attention of every man in the room. He pointed at the case like it was a punchline he'd been waiting his whole career to deliver. "Harrington," he said, not even looking at her, "what is your girl bringing to my range?" "Corporal Yates." Harrington glanced sideways at her and then looked away. He'd been her partner on the transport from Trenton. He'd seemed decent enough for the 6-hour drive. Now he was examining something very interesting on the ceiling. Sergeant Decker walked over and crouched down beside her case. He read the latching mechanism the way a man reads a menu at a restaurant he's already decided he doesn't like. Then he stood up, crossed his arms, and looked at her. "You're Sable?" "Corporal Sable, yes, Sergeant." "Corporal Sable." He said it the way you'd repeat something a child just told you. "You requested a spot in this evaluation." "I did." "You know what this evaluation is?" "I do." "Do you?" It wasn't a question. "Because the women I've had come through here before, and there have been 2, both requested transfers before the end of week 1. Not because I pushed them out." He held up a hand as if she were about to argue, though she had said nothing. "Because the conditions are not suited to." He paused, choosing the word carefully. "Everyone." She waited. He looked at her case again. "That's a psychotra." "It is." "You bring your own equipment to my evaluation." The request form said personal equipment was permitted. He turned to the room, which was absolute pretending to be busy. "She read the form," he announced. Several men laughed. One of them, a ranger with a thick neck and no visible sense of irony, made a comment about bringing a toy to a toolbox. She let it land. She didn't pick it up. That was the first morning. She'd been shooting since she was 9 years old. Her father had been a conservation officer in Northern Ontario, posted outside of Cochrane for most of her childhood. He wasn't a military man. He didn't talk about marksmanship as a discipline or a craft or a calling. For him, it was just a thing you did, a practical thing. You learned it the way you learned to change a tire or read a weather system coming off James Bay. You learned it because the bush did not care about your feelings, and the bush was always there. Her mother had grown up in the Cree community at Moose Factory. She had a different relationship to the land than her father did. Quieter, less inclined to explain itself. She taught Corporal Sable things her father never thought to. How to be still. How to wait without getting restless. How to sit inside your own patience like it was a coat you put on in cold weather. They were both gone now. Her father in 2019, a cardiac event while checking a trap line. Her mother 14 months later, in a way the family still did not discuss at length. Corporal Sable had buried them both before she was 26. She joined the Canadian Army at 22, 3 years before her father died. He'd been quietly proud. Her mother had said very little and hugged her for a long time at the airport. She'd come up through the infantry, then done her sniper course at CFB Gagetown, where she had qualified at a level that prompted her warrant officer to check her score sheet twice and then ask the course director to check it a 3rd time. Not because they doubted the number, because the number was unusual. She knew what she was capable of. She'd known for years. The problem, and it was a problem she had stopped trying to solve and started simply navigating, was that knowing what you were capable of and getting other people to believe it were 2 entirely different tasks, and only one of them had anything to do with her actual skill. The evaluation was a 5-day field assessment for a specialized reconnaissance insertion unit operating under Ranger Command. They were not officially recruiting women. There was no policy against it. There was simply a gap between what the policy said and what the culture assumed. And that gap had its own gravity, its own way of pulling things back toward the center. She had requested a spot through the proper channels, waited 4 months for a response, and then been told she could attend as an observer. She had written back, politely, to clarify the difference between an observer and a candidate. They had written back to say the evaluation was not designed for candidates of her. And here the word choice had been careful, profile. She had written back once more, and this time she had attached her marksmanship scores, her PT results, and a 2-paragraph note from the officer commanding her unit, who had used the words exceptional and unambiguous in the same sentence. She was granted a spot. Not warmly, but she was granted one. The first day was a physical assessment. She had known it would be used against her. Not officially, not openly, but in the way that unofficial things happen, through atmosphere and implication, and the low, steady pressure of being measured by people who have already decided the measurement. There were 11 candidates total. She was the only woman. The morning started with a loaded march. 22 kilometers, mixed terrain, her kit weighing 37 pounds. Sergeant Decker had walked beside her for the first 3 kilometers, not speaking, occasionally checking his watch with a theatrical attention that suggested he was keeping time on her specifically. She finished 7th, not first. She knew she wouldn't finish first. There were men in that group with longer legs and 20 more pounds of muscle and years of conditioning that looked exactly like hers from the outside, but had different physics on the inside. She was not going to pretend otherwise. She had never been interested in pretending. She finished 7th, and she finished clean. Her breathing was controlled when she crossed the line. She drank water, found a place to sit with her back against a wall, and ate half a protein bar while she waited for the rest of the group to come in. The man who'd made the toy comment, his name was Corporal Sable, and he had a way of taking up space in rooms that wasn't about his size. Finished 9th. He looked at her when he crossed the line. She was already looking at something else. That evening in the bunkhouse, she heard someone say through the thin partition wall that she'd probably had a lighter kit. She noted it. She did not respond to it. She'd been told in different ways and by different people since she was roughly 15 years old that her results required explanation. That there was some variable, some asterisk, some technical reason why what had just happened was not quite what it appeared to be. She had stopped being surprised by this. She had also stopped letting it itch. Day 2 was the range. Sergeant Decker ran it himself. He had a style on the range that was different from his style in the armory. More controlled, more professional, the kind of man who took the craft seriously even when he didn't take the person seriously. She could respect the distinction, even if she didn't particularly admire it. The assessment was a series of engagements at varying distances and conditions. Static targets at 400 meters, moving targets at 250, unknown distance targets to be ranged by the shooter, then engaged, with no feedback until the full string was complete. She shot in the 4th group. She set up her sacco the way she always did, unhurried, without flourish, the kind of routine that looks like nothing. Because it has been done so many times that the body does it before the mind has finished deciding to. She checked her data book. She checked the wind with a reading she'd taken 20 minutes earlier and one she took now, watching a piece of surveyor's tape she'd tied to a stake down range during the setup window. Corporal Sable was in her group. He shot adequately. He was good, genuinely good, she thought, watching his group on the 400 target, but he shot like someone who was performing, and performance adds a layer between the shooter and the work that a serious shooter cannot afford. When her turn came, she shot the static targets first. She wasn't fast. Speed was not what this asked for. She was consistent. Her group at 400 was tight enough that the range officer walked down range to look at it and then said nothing for a moment. The moving targets were where most people leaked shots. The mind wants to chase. The mind wants to lead aggressively, to correct, to compensate. She had learned, had been taught partly, and had partly taught herself through hours in the pre-dawn stillness of the Ontario bush, to trust the picture she'd built before the movement started, to fire into the solution, not at the problem. She hit all 6. The unknown distance targets were her favorite. She had always found a particular satisfaction in the problem of ranging, in the discipline of estimation, the application of logic to a visual field, the way that a skilled shooter could convert what she was seeing into a number and then convert that number into a firing solution without a single piece of electronics to confirm it. It was, when it worked, a kind of argument between the shooter and the physics of the world, and the satisfying part was not winning the argument, but being precise enough that winning became inevitable. She ranged all 4 targets correctly. She engaged them cleanly. The range officer wrote something in his clipboard and did not say anything to her directly. But she noticed that he turned the clipboard toward Sergeant Decker without being asked, and that Sergeant Decker looked at it for several seconds longer than the information required. Day 3 was where it usually went wrong, not on the ranges, not on the physical assessments. Day 3 was the team problem, a scenario exercise run in a 4-person group designed to evaluate decision-making, communication, and the ability to function in a team under simulated stress. It was the day where the unofficial things had the most room to operate because scenario exercises were evaluated subjectively, and subjective evaluations carried the fingerprints of whoever was holding the pen. Her group was herself. Corporal Sable, a ranger corporal named Wyndham, who had barely spoken to her in 3 days, and a private named Seeger, who was 19 years old, and had the concentrated focus of someone who had not yet learned that the world might contain obstacles he wouldn't be able to outrun. The scenario: a reconnaissance mission, enemy position to be identified and reported, with a communications failure at a critical moment that required improvised adaptation. Standard structure: the kind of thing she'd run variations of in training a dozen times. Thiessen assumed leadership without discussion and without checking whether anyone had a different read on the situation. He moved fast, issued directions that were efficient enough, but lacked the kind of positional awareness that the scenario rewarded. He was running his previous training, not reading the current problem. She let him go for about 4 minutes. Then she said quietly and without challenge in her voice, "Thiessen, check your left flank. You've got a sightline exposure the evaluators are going to use." He turned and looked. The exposure was there. He did not thank her, but he adjusted. She fed information into the group for the next 40 minutes the way you'd adjust a valve. Steadily, without drama, giving the team what it needed without making the giving into a thing that required a response. Private Seeger noticed. He started orienting toward her when he had a question, which Thiessen noticed and did not like. When the communications failure hit, she'd already identified 2 contingency routes based on what she'd been watching. Since the start, she laid them out. Wyndham, who still hadn't said much, looked at the terrain sketch she made in the dirt and nodded once. And it was the kind of nod that meant something, not the kind that was just movement. They completed the scenario inside the time window. They were one of 3 groups to do so. In the debrief, the evaluator, not Decker, but a captain named Reeve, who had watched the exercise from a distance with a stillness that suggested she was very good at her job, wrote in her assessment form for several minutes. She did not share what she wrote. She did not look at any of the candidates while she was writing, which was professional in a way that made you trust the result even if you couldn't read it. Thiessen, walking back to the bunkhouse, told Wyndham that the scenario had been designed to favor quiet operators over aggressive ones, and that this was, in his view, not realistic. She heard this. She did not weigh in. Day 4 was long. 12 hours in the field, a combination of land navigation, observation post work, and a final shooting problem conducted at last light under time pressure. The kind of day that didn't break people at the front end. It broke them in the middle, around hour 7 or 8, when the body was still functional, but the mind started doing arithmetic about how much was left and whether the math worked out. She had learned about this particular kind of exhaustion from her mother, though her mother had never framed it in those terms. She'd learned it through winters in the bush and long silences, and the understanding that discomfort was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be occupied. You didn't fight it. You moved through it the way water moved through rock. Not by force, but by persistence. Hour 7, she was on an observation post with Seeger. They'd been lying in a depression behind a fallen birch for 90 minutes, watching a designated grid. Seeger was cramping in his left leg. She could tell by the way his breathing had changed and the small controlled movements he was making every 4 minutes, trying to work the muscle without giving their position away. She said nothing for a while. Then she said, barely above a whisper, "Flex your toes, slowly, not your whole foot." He looked at her. "Toes first," she said. "It'll work." He tried it. After a minute, his breathing leveled out. He didn't say thank you. You didn't say thank you on an OP in a training scenario that was being evaluated. But later, at the water point during the resupply, he found a way to be nearby when she was filling her bottles, and she understood that as the thing it was. The last light shooting problem was a single-shot engagement on a partially obscured target at 620 meters, declining light, mild variable wind. The kind of problem that did not ask for brilliance. It asked for patience, composure, and the willingness to wait for the right moment instead of firing into the conditions you had and hoping. She waited 4 minutes for a wind lull that lasted less than 3 seconds. She fired once. She did not look through the scope to confirm. She had already known before the rifle settled. The results were posted on the morning of day 5. She was standing outside with a cup of tea when Sergeant Decker came out and stood about 2 meters away from her and looked at the same tree line she was looking at. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not be planning to speak at all. "Your range scores," he said finally. She waited. "They're the highest in the group." She said nothing. This was not a surprise to her, and she didn't want to perform surprise she didn't feel. The captain's recommendation is that you advance. She looked at her tea. I want you to know, Decker said. And his voice had changed, not warmer, exactly, but more careful, more considered. The voice of a man choosing words he wasn't used to choosing, that I had a position going into this week. I know, she said. He looked at her directly for the first time that wasn't about assessment or the management of assessment. I know you know, he said. I'm saying it anyway, because you're owed that. The tree line didn't move. A raven went over low and deliberate, and she watched it until it cleared the ridge. My mother used to say, she said, not looking at him, that the quietest person in the room is usually watching the most. He seemed to think about this for a moment. Then he went back inside. She was sitting on her bunk that evening, cleaning her rifle with the same unhurried, methodical attention she'd applied to everything else that week, when Private Seeger appeared in the doorway. He knocked on the frame even though there was no door. Corporal Sable, Seeger. He was 19, and he hadn't yet figured out how to say what he meant when he meant something real. She remembered being that age and having the same problem. I just wanted to say. He stopped, started again. Before I joined up, I thought the hardest part was going to be the physical stuff. He was looking at the floor. I didn't know it was going to be the other thing, proving that you belong somewhere that's already decided you don't. She set down the cleaning rod. You thought it was going to be about strength. Yeah, most people do. He looked up. How do you do it? Not let it get to you, she thought about that. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted to give him the real one, not the useful one, not the one that sounded strong. It gets to me, she said. It always has. I just stopped waiting for it to stop. He nodded slowly. She could see him filing that away somewhere careful. Get some sleep, Seeger. He went. She picked up the cleaning rod and went back to work. Outside, the base had gone quiet. Through the small, high window above her bunk, she could see a strip of northern Ontario sky. The stars beginning to come in from the east, the kind of sky her father had taught her to read, and her mother had taught her to sit under, without needing to name everything she saw. Tomorrow there would be paperwork. There would be a handshake from Captain Reeve, who would be professional and precise, and would not make the moment larger than it was. There would be a transition brief and kit inventory, and a dozen administrative tasks that would sand the edges off whatever this week had been, fold it into the machinery of the institution, and move it along. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, she sat with the work in front of her, the carbon on the barrel, the clean oil smell, the particular silence of a rifle that had done what it was built to do, and she let it be enough. She had come here with a question someone else had written in the air around her and left hanging there for years. She hadn't set out to answer it dramatically. She hadn't needed to. The question had answered itself.